So with that in mind, we're going to just finish off a little bit of Genesis 3. And we're going to then look today at Genesis 4 and the story of Cain. And then we're going to finish off with a little exercise, which you may have to complete at home, just to look at Genesis 5. So we'll have done 5 chapters, which I think is a pretty good achievement. But I want to just go back to have a little look at Eve this morning. Or as she's called in Hebrew, Cheva. After me. Cheva. Cheva. That's what the Hebrew name is for Eve, which I prefer to Eve. I like Cheva. Sounds really good. Which, of course, her name comes from, the meaning of her name is made explicit, isn't it, in Genesis 3, verse 20. Who'd like to just read that for us? Genesis 3, verse 20. As you're there, Nossa, have you got it on your phone? Yeah.
And Adam called his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living.
Okay. So Eve's name, Cheva, comes from, the meaning behind it is the mother of all living. Em Kal Chei in the Hebrew. Because we know what the modern Hebrew word for mother is, don't we? I know, Alan, you were particularly waiting for some Hebrew this morning. What's the modern Hebrew word for mother? Anyone who's watched The Chosen will know this. I'm looking over at Nadina, who's a great fan. What is it? Ima. Ima is mother. What is father? What is father in Hebrew? Obviously, it's not written like that, but Abba. So in the Hebrew, the mother of all living is Em Kal. Oops. I think there's a little accent there. Em Kal Chei. This is very loose. And Chei is the word for living, for life. And we were talking about this the other day, weren't we? When it's like, like when people have a drink and they say cheers within Judaism, within the Jewish culture, when they clink glasses, what do they say? L'chaim, which is to life. So the name of Eve really is wrapped up with this idea of being the mother of all living. Of course, we can understand that biologically, can't we? She was the mother of all living, apart from Adam. So everyone who's ever lived came from Cheva. She's the mother of all living. But I get the feeling as I read Genesis, early Genesis, that the scripture sort of hints at a different sort of theological reality of motherhood that I just want to explore briefly. And it only really becomes apparent as the wider sort of message of salvation and life unfolds in the scriptures. And we've been told in Genesis 3, we read this yesterday, of course, that the seed of the woman would be the one who would ultimately defeat the very spirit that had deceived Eve. Is that true? I'll say it again. The seed of the woman would be the very one who would defeat the one who had deceived the woman in the first place. I'm not trying to be flashy, but what is the word for seed in Hebrew? Because it's interesting, and Paul talks about this in his letters. The word begins with a Z. Zerah. The Zerah. And Paul makes a note, doesn't he, when he talks about Abraham and the promises given to Abraham, that this word is used in the singular. It's the same here in Genesis, that the words that God spoke to Eve after the fall about the coming seed were in the singular. That the seed of the woman, singular, would do what? Would crush the serpent's heads. And so it's looking forward. This is incredible, isn't it? In Genesis, we have the scriptures point forward to the day when a person, one person, the seed of Eve, singular, would crush the heads of the seed of the serpent. Singular. So we have in Genesis, I think this is wonderful, we have a prophecy really, it's a messianic prophecy, but we have a prophecy concerning the ultimate defeat of the enemy, the ultimate defeat of the serpent in the garden. And I love what it says in Genesis 3:15, he will crush your head and you will strike his heel, which of course, I think is a reference to the cross, isn't it? It's a reference to the sufferings of Christ, that Christ would suffer, his heel would be struck, he would suffer through the work of wickedness, but ultimately, even in that striking of the heel, the head of the serpent would be crushed, because we know it's at the cross that Satan is defeated. So we have here, I find this mind-blowing, written thousands of years before the coming of Christ, we have a prophecy not just concerning the coming of the seed, but the coming of a suffering seed and the coming of an act which would defeat the enemy of humanity. That sounds to me like the gospel, right there in Genesis 3. But there's something else that I want to just point out to you. You may not have heard this, that all of that may not be a particularly fresh thought for you, but there's something else which I want to just point out, which may be a fresh thought to you, and that is found in the first part of that verse, Genesis 3:15, and it says this, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. I will put enmity. What does enmity mean? Being enemies. I will put enmity between who? Between you, talking to the serpents. I will put enmity between the serpents and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. So this is a very important sort of theological moment, because we've just been told that the seed of the woman would be against the seed of the serpent, and the seed of the woman, Jesus, would ultimately crush the seed of the serpent. But we're told something a little bit different here. What are we told?
The serpent also had seed.
The serpent had seed, yeah.
That was about offspring.
Yeah. The offspring of wickedness, yeah. But there's something else there. Where's my board rubber gone? Da-da. Have a look at that verse, 3:15. I will put enmity between you, who? The serpent, and the woman.
Okay, so it's not talking about Eve there, it's talking about a different,
No, it's talking about Eve.
about the church. I was wondering.
Well, this is an interesting thought. What's it really talking about? It's saying, yes, the seed of the woman will one day crush the serpent, but it's also saying, I will put enmity between the serpent and the woman, which is talking about Eve, which is fascinating because what it's doing is it's putting, think of it like this, it's sort of theologically juxtaposing the woman and wickedness. And it's saying wickedness is over here, and yet the woman is going to be theologically separate and different over here. Do you see that? The seed of the wicked seed will come, and ultimately from that there will be the seed of wickedness that Christ will crush. But the woman is sort of set apart theologically. Can you see that? As opposed to wickedness. Eve is presented as being opposed to wickedness. Have you seen that before? It's a big thought. She has, if you like, she occupies a different, if you don't understand, try ask me questions, but she occupies a different spiritual and moral space than that of the spirit of wickedness, the serpent. Do you see? So we have Eve over here, the mother of all living, and then we have the serpent here. And they are in opposition, according to the words of Genesis 3:15. So Eve occupies a different moral, a different spiritual space than the serpent and those that would come from the serpents. So to understand her contrasting spiritual position, let's just look back to what happens in Genesis 3:17 and the events that, Genesis 3:7 and the events that sort of unfolded. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I just want to recap it. Someone could read that, Genesis 3:7. Come on, let's have volunteers. Don't be shy. Genesis 3:7, Susan.
Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves.
Okay, so Adam and Eve have just eaten the fruit they shouldn't have eaten. Their eyes have been opened, and they recognize that they're naked. And it says that they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. That's why I always think the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was a fig tree, because it was the nearest leaf available. So they took it and that's a little theory. And I think the tree of life was an olive tree, just out of interest. But they cover themselves up, don't they? And human beings have been covering themselves up ever since, because that's what sin does, isn't it? When we sin outside of Christ, we cover it up. Am I talking to any human beings in the room? When we do the things that we know we shouldn't be doing, we sort of hide what we're doing. And we live in a way that presents something that we're not. And Jesus often spoke about this as, of course, hypocrisy. So we have human beings behaving in a very human way in Genesis 3 verse 7. But then we read that they're expelled from the garden. They go out of the garden east of Eden, into Eden. We talked about this yesterday, into a place where God does something. What does he do? He makes them clothing by sacrifice. So the human covering, the covering of the fig leaves was inadequate in the eyes of God. It was unable to cover their nakedness, their shame, really is a motif. Nakedness is a motif for shame in the Old Testament. Their own attempts to cover their shame were ineffective. Their own attempts to cover their guilt were ineffective. So God himself has to sacrifice an animal and then clothe them with the skin of the animal that he sacrificed. God is really presented here as the first priest. It's a priestly act that God does in killing this animal. And I said to you yesterday that I believe that, I believe it was a burnt offering. That was the first burnt offering in the Hebrew Bible, because if you look at the description in Leviticus of how a burnt offering was carried out, the whole creature was burnt apart from its skin. And the skin was kept by the priesthood. And in fact, all of the sacrifices in Leviticus really point backwards to events in early Genesis or earlier parts of the story of the people of Israel. And the burnt offering points back to that moment when God himself killed an animal to cover them in a moment that would prefigure, of course, the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ. That sounds a whole lot like the gospel to me, right there in Genesis 3. There's a lot of gospel. And in fact, I like to think, I don't know this for sure, but I like to think that when God sacrificed the animal and gave them something to wear, I like to think that God explained to them that what it was. I don't know this, but I'd like to think God explained to them the significance of the sacrifice and that they needed covering, they needed forgiving, and that sacrifice would one day come, and through faith in that coming sacrifice, they would have access back into the place of blessing that they had had to leave because of sin. Do you see that? They had access back, if you like. I know they weren't able to physically go back into the garden, but they were able to spiritually go back into the garden and eat from the tree of life, because they were able to reconnect with God through sacrifice. Yes. Yeah, I think there is. Ask the question again on the thing so everyone can hear.
Is there any connection between the fig tree and the fig tree that Jesus cursed?
Yes. Personally, I think yes. I think it was a massive statement about sin, about the end of sin, about the end of the fruits of sin. In fact, there was no fruit on the tree, was there? Which is why Jesus cursed it, because the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, theologically, can never produce the fruit that God requires. In fact, it produced poisonous fruit. In fact, it produced death, didn't it? So I think that's why I think it was. I don't think it was just that they had fig leaves. I think the fact Jesus curses that fig tree is a very big, it seems like a really random thing. Jesus is hungry and he go, oh, there's no figs. I was just going to curse this fig tree. Like, I don't think it was just like Jesus was having he was hangry. I don't think Jesus was hangry. He actually wanted to say something very important before he went to his death, that the time of sin was coming to an end. So, going back to Eve, can you see why, or where I'm going with this, that there is this spiritual distinction between the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of the woman, that is, the offspring of those. What I'm suggesting to you is that Eve had faith. She had faith. I think Adam had faith too. And that when she is named the mother of all living, Chava, she isn't just the mother of all who would biologically live, but she is the mother of all who would live because of faith. She is the mother of faith. I think that's got to be the answer if we take that sort of juxtaposition between the woman being placed in a place of adversity against the serpent. Because we know, don't we, that through our faith, we belong to God, and that we have an enemy. And the enemy, we are the offspring of Eve in a theological sense by faith, but we are also the offspring of Eve biologically. Isn't that a good thought? That's my thoughts. Is that a question?
Yes.
Hang on, Mandy. I'm talking to the mic.
So if that's the case,
Yeah.
then do the next verses also have a much wider application in terms of if the woman there is talking about people of the offspring of faith, if you like,
Yeah.
then do the next verses, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. So that's to do with maybe producing offspring, more offspring. With pain you will give birth to children of faith maybe. Your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. Is that talking about the Lord there? Then?
Yeah, I mean, the whole passage changes dramatically from a sort of natural, it's fully the case naturally, but it's also, there's a spiritual dimension, which I find it so encouraging, that idea that God sacrificed for Adam and Eve, and that was a way of covering them, and really a sacrifice that pointed forward to the coming of Christ, which through their faith in the coming one, their faith in the coming sacrifice, the coming seed, this is the whole Old Testament faith. All of the Old Testament faith was based on the idea that one day someone was going to come, the coming seed was on his way, the coming king was on his way, the suffering servant was on his way, the coming lamb was on his way, the coming Messiah is on his way, and one day he's going to arrive and pay the price for sin to make atonement. our faith goes backwards looks backwards to the coming of Christ, but their faith looked forward to the coming of Christ. Do you see? And I think it started right there in the garden with the first human beings who, after the fall, are immediately restored to a place of fellowship with God through faith. And in fact, the fellowship and relationship carries on, because if you look in Genesis 4, verse 1, we will read Genesis 4 in a moment. It says, Adam made love to his wife Eve, Chava, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord, I love this, I have brought forth a man. She's in relationship with God. I think God was the first midwife with the help of the Lord. The Lord helped deliver that baby into the world. That's my little thing. The Lord is the first everything. You know, he's the first taxonomist. He's the first priest. He's the first midwife. He's the first teacher. He's doing a lot, the Lord, in these first few chapters. So the idea really carries on with the next generation, because what we find with Adam and Eve's children, Cain and Abel, is that they go on to... Sacrifice is the main feature, isn't it, of what happens in Genesis 4. We are going to read it. But do you remember what it says in Hebrews 11, verse 4? It says, by faith, Abel brought a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous. When God spoke well of his offerings, by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. So in Hebrews 11, Abel is sort of held up as the paragon of faith, isn't he? He offered a right sacrifice, whereas Cain didn't. And we often think, you know, what was it? What was wrong? Didn't God like vegetables? You know, because Cain offers vegetables, and Abel offers the flock from the flock. But it wasn't about that. It was about the fact that Abel was a man of faith. And he offered in faith, and he understood the significance, I believe, of the sacrifice as it pointed forward to the coming of the seed, whereas Cain clearly has got some real spiritual problems, hasn't he? And, of course, ends up murdering his brother, which we'll read in a moment. But can you see how I'm just trying to present this idea to you that I think hidden in the narrative, faith is operating. Faith in the coming seed, the coming one is operating, and that one day that person would arrive. And I think Eve, it's interesting, isn't it, that Eve becomes, if my suggestion is correct, that Eve is the mother of all who would believe. Isn't it interesting that Adam becomes the father of what in the teachings of Paul? What does Paul speak about in Romans when he talks about being in Adam? Is being in Adam a good thing, or is it being in sin? Yeah. So I think it's fascinating to me that Paul no one seems to really talk about this in the New Testament, but we have this idea of Eve being the mother of faith and Adam being the one from whom sin, the father of sin, really the father of the sinful nature. And that's how they're used sort of theologically it's used in Romans. And in fact, Paul also, he doesn't talk about Eve as the mother of faith, but he does talk about someone as the father of faith. Abraham. And in fact, the promises given to Abraham are very similar to those that we read in Genesis 3, aren't they? That he has promised a seed in that sense, and he sort of inherits those promises that were given to Eve. So there's lots we could say about this, but can you see the gospel is well present in these early chapters of Genesis? And I love the idea, I really love it, that the idea that the cross is there. I really love the idea that Eve and Adam had faith in the coming one. And that was really the foundation on which Old Testament faith was always meant to be built. And of course, we see that with Cain and Abel, two different sacrifices were being made, but one was unacceptable and one was acceptable. And we read this, don't we, throughout the Old Testament. We read in the book of Isaiah that he finds the sacrifices of the Israelites detestable because they were not offered with faith. They were offered religiously whilst all sorts of evil was going on. So that sort of motif of right sacrifice, wrong sacrifice that Jesus also addressed is present right there in the beginning of Genesis. We could talk about that for a long time, but we won't. Genesis 4, we're going to read it through. And we need someone with a lovely, nice, clear voice to read Genesis 4. Brian, you've just been volunteered by your wife. Let's read it through.
Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of God, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favour on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favour. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael was the father of Methusael, and Methusael was the father of Lamech. Lamech married 2 women, one named Adah and the other Zillah. Adah gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play stringed instruments and pipes. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, "Listen to me, wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord."
Thank you, Brian. Beautifully read. Yes. Wonderful. So, what I'd like you to do, we're going to talk a bit about Cain. We're going to talk a bit about vengeance. We're going to talk a little bit about the image of, and the, yeah, you can have that, yeah, and the likeness of God in a moment. And but before doing that, what I'd like you to do, I'd just like you to, on your sheets, you can just do a little family tree for me. Start with Adam and Eve, but I'd like you to do a little family tree of Cain's family. You can't really read Genesis without doing a family tree. You just have to do it. But start with Adam and Eve and go down. For a few minutes, and then we'll have a little coffee break. We need to ask, a few people are asking the Cain question. What do I mean by that? I mean, where did Cain's wife come from? Where did Cain's wife come from? What's the answer? Adam and Eve had other children. Like for me, again, when I used to be a school teacher, the kids used to say this to me, yes, but where did Cain's wife... I said, well, it's quite obvious. Adam and Eve had daughters. We're told, actually, Genesis 5, they had daughters and sons, as well as the ones that are named. So they had daughters. And the other thing worth saying, and it ties in with your question, Percy, would you repeat your question with the mic? Nossa?
My question was that Cain feared that he would be killed, but it would appear then that there's no one there to kill him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we are going to answer that question directly. But one thing I would just say, the thing we have to remember is that these people lived for a long time. Okay? They lived for a long time. They had long lives. And they were also, something Mandy was saying, they were also like genetically perfect. You know, they began to deteriorate, but at this point, they were fresh creations, and they were only like a few generations in. So that's why I always say that's why they lived a long time, because they didn't have a lot of the problems that come with. I mean, God did limit the age of a human being after the flood, but they didn't have any of those sort of hereditary problems, genetic problems that we all sort of have to sort of deal with now. So let's just have a little think about this. One thing to say about the genealogy of Genesis 4, it's quite different, isn't it, from the other genealogies that we find in early Genesis. For example, if you just flip over to Genesis 5, just quickly, what you'll see there is when we look at the genealogy of Adam through Seth, we see that a lot more detail is given, isn't it? There's loads of detail. It says the names of all the children, and it says how long they lived. If you look over in Genesis 11, just flip over to Genesis 11, there is actually another little genealogy there from Shem, the descendant of Noah, all the way through to Abraham. And I like this genealogy because it tells us not just who the people were and how long they lived, but it also tells us how old they were when they had their children. So we're given quite a lot of information in the genealogies of Genesis 11 and Genesis 5, but in Genesis 4, we're not given any of that information at all. We're just given a list of the descendants of Cain through his... How many wives did he have? 2 wives. And Lamech, how many generations down is Lamech? Because the story sort of ends up by talking about this person called Lamech. 6 from Adam and Eve, yeah. So let's just talk about this briefly, then we'll have a little break. After Cain is banished, he complains to God that he's just going to be killed. And God tells him, not so. But anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And, that's an interesting verse. What does that mean? And at face value, it reads basically as a warning against anyone killing Cain. Would you agree? And in fact, how does God seal that warning? How does he? He marks him. He puts a mark on Cain. We don't know what the mark is, but he puts a mark on Cain that served as a warning to anyone. If you kill Cain, you will suffer vengeance. How many times? 7 times. Now, it's interesting, and I'm just going to throw a little thought out to you on this one, and you can disagree. But I think we can say that sounds very vengeful, like God saying, if you kill, I'm going to punish you 7 times over. It doesn't really it doesn't really say that. It says you will suffer vengeance. This is quite important. You will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Why would someone who killed Cain suffer vengeance 7 times over? Well, I think this is what's going on. That what happens when someone commits a heinous crime, do you know what I mean by heinous crime? Like murder or rape or those terrible crimes that destroy people's lives, and the perpetrators go to prison normally for a long time and used to be murdered, not murdered, but hung or whatever. I think something is happening, that there were 3 definite individuals who had a right to vengeance. Who were they? When Cain killed Abel, who had, we know the right to vengeance is what we have, but we don't go there, do we? We forgive. But in this instant, how many people had, named people had a right to vengeance in this story? Adam and Eve. Why? They're his parents. I think we can forget this. You know, we read about the story of Cain and Abel, but the truth is, can you imagine what they suffered? What Cain and Abel suffered? They lived in a perfect world. They loved their children. They were happy. They would have been happy. And then this terrible thing happens where one of their other children kills Abel, their son. And that would have been, they were victims, weren't they? We forget that. They would have been heartbroken.
They lost both their sons, really.
They lost both their sons. Yeah, they lost one son to evil and they lost one son to murder. Fratricide, actually, not just murder. It was like fratricide, brother killing brother. And I think it's worth remembering that. And, you know, if you've ever spoken to anyone who's lost a child, you'll know it's something that people never recover from. They never, I mean, we don't recover from losing people we love, but there's something about losing a child which is probably the greatest pain that a human being could ever suffer, losing a child. And here we forget the emotional toll that must have had on Adam and Eve. There was one other named person who, so they had a right, they could have really had vengeance, couldn't they? They could have said, we need to punish Cain. Who was the other named person who had a right to vengeance? God. Leave God aside for the minute. Seth hadn't been born yet.
Does Abel have a wife? He must have a wife, right?
We're not told that Abel had a wife.
He must have had a wife.
He might have had a wife. It's true, he might have had a wife. But I'm saying named people. We can theorize on the other ones in a minute, but there's one other. It was Abel. Why do I say Abel? Because what does it say happened when Abel was killed? His blood cried out from the grounds. That's what God said. His blood cries out from the grounds. What was it crying out? It was crying out for vengeance. And in fact, we know the blood of Christ speaks a better word than the blood of Abel.
Wow. That's amazing.
And I don't like it, it's not nice, but I like that image in Revelation where we see the martyrs, the vision of the martyrs, when the 5th seal is opened. They're under the altar, aren't they? And they're not, what are they doing? What are they doing under the altar? They're crying out for what? For vengeance. How long, Lord? Until our blood is avenged. So Abel's blood was crying out, if you like, and Adam and Eve would have been crying out. There's a sense of like this right to vengeance was there. And in fact, we know that Abel couldn't avenge his own death. That's abstract thought, but it goes down to what Ben said, that God is the one who has the right to avenge. Is that true? God avenges. I was looking for the verse. Deuteronomy 32:35 said, "It is mine to avenge. I will repay," says the Lord. Yeah. So there's three definite people there. So when God said to Abraham, "You will suffer vengeance 7 times over," he's sort of implying that by carrying out a heinous crime, you provoke vengeance in other family members. And I'm guessing, I don't know, but there were at least 4, we know that Adam and Eve had daughters as well. Because the other thing is, if a heinous crime is committed against a family member, the siblings also suffer. They lose a brother. They lose a sister. So I'm just putting it out there. I'm not saying I know for sure, but I'm just saying, like, at face value, it seems like God is speaking into this idea that sin and heinous crime and sin cannot just be, doesn't just injure the person, doesn't just injure the immediate victim. We know that, don't we? But it has implications. And that I suggest there were 4 unnamed injured parties who would have had the right to vengeance. And one thing, what we see this is sort of developed in the story of Lamech that the chapter goes on to talk about. And we begin to get this idea that sin isn't just something that affects the immediate generation of a family, but it also affects future generations. And we know this as well, don't we? Why are people still fighting wars in some part of the world? Because they're still seeking vengeance for something that happened 300 years ago. When someone was murdered or someone was killed or some atrocity took place, there is still this sort of hunger for vengeance that goes down the generations, generation to generation to generation. And we end up with intractable situations that will, you look at somewhere like Northern Ireland, that people are still killing each other. Because sin works generationally. And what we see here, we see that Lamech, who is 6 generations after Adam and Eve, just like his great-great-great-great-grandfather, back how many times, he's a murderer. We see this a lot in the early Old Testament, the early chapters of Genesis, is that sin, it gets repeated generationally. Can anyone think of a really good example of that in early Genesis, where it's actually uncannily similar? Yes, Bean, well done. What part, Mr. Yeah, that's it. It's actually unbelievable. Abraham lies about his wife being his sister, and then Isaac literally uses the same lie. It's like, can you not think of something a bit more original? But it's like the idea of generational, sin goes down through. And of course, we know as well that God himself said, in Exodus, talking about his compassion for the thousands of generations, he also says he does not leave the guilty unpunished, but he punishes sin to the 3rd and 4th generation. So sin has a generational impact. And in fact, I sort of feel like there's power for us as Christians in repenting of things that our family have done. I really believe this, that I've done it. I spend time doing it, the things we know about, We say, I'm so sorry, Lord. As a representative of my family, I'm so sorry that my family did that. And we repent of the sins of our nation. I'm so sorry, Lord, that the nation of which I'm a part has done terrible things, embarrassingly shameful things. I apologize, Lord. I am sorry, Lord. Because we know that God visits punishment upon the iniquity that is passed on from generation to generation to generation. And we have a role as the Church of Jesus Christ to bring forgiveness into the mix and to break the cycle and spiral of violence. And that's what we see here actually in the story, as we see a spiral of violence begins to develop, because we're told that Lamech kills a young man. We're not told any details, very vague, but he says, I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. Lamech got into a fight with some young guy, and in revenge for being injured, he murders him. That's what's happened there, isn't it? He is injured by a young man. He has vengeance against that person. the vengeance is a lot greater than the original injury, and he kills a young man. And then he says this thing, which is quite a cheeky, wicked thing to say, I think. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Why did he say that? We're familiar with this verse, aren't we? Why are we so familiar with this verse? Who said Jesus? Yeah, the story of Peter. Yeah. What did Peter say? How many times must I don't know if you've ever asked God this, how many times have I got to forgive this Lord? And God says, and Peter says, 7 times? 7 times, Lord? Surely, 7 times, Lord, that's pretty generous of me. But Jesus says, not 7 times, but 77 times. Or sometimes it's put 70 times 7, isn't it? The Hebrew says 77 times in this story. And I like that idea that I think in some ways this has become a sort of idiom in a way in Jesus' teaching. He's taking this idiomatically and he's saying, whereas we have a spiral of violence here to 77 times, he's saying we need a spiral of forgiveness. That's what Jesus is saying, isn't it? The world is being ruined by unforgiveness, and Jesus is saying we need an exponential explosion of forgiveness. That's what I think Jesus is saying. But talking about Lamech, I think his understanding is not nice, it's evil. That he's saying that if he was murdered in an act of vengeance for his own murder of a young man, he would be avenged 77 times. Can you see that? He was injured in a fight. He avenges, kills that young man. And he says, if anybody kills me, this is so wicked, if anybody kills me, watch out. You will suffer vengeance, not just 7 times, 77 times. Why did he say that? According to my little theory about people that would have a right to vengeance, what do you think Lamech's saying?
That he's never, that the cycle will just carry on continually. Is it like,
Yeah.
is the 77 basically saying like endlessly? Or
Say it, Jed, yeah, I think.
Talking about his family members.
He's talking about I think he's claiming to have a big family. He's claiming to have a big family. He's basically saying, I don't know whether he actually had 77 family members, but we're talking about how many generations after Adam and Eve? 6 generations. We're talking about he had 2 wives, didn't he? So it wasn't just that, Lamech had probably, his parents were living, his grandparents were living, his great-grandparents were living, his uncles were living, his aunties were living, he's probably got a batch of children who are living, he's got siblings, and, there's a lot of people. He's basically saying, if you touch me, I'm going to get my family on you. I didn't want to say, but some of those big Irish families, Kathy, you wouldn't mess with Kathy because you'd have 5 generations down knocking on your door. Was that a question?
Yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking, because you mentioned about the generation thing, bit passed on from generation to generation.
Yeah.
And in chapter 5, verse 31, I wondered if this relates to it. It says, all the days of Lamech's life was 777 years.
Oh, yeah. I'd never noticed that before. Lamech lived a total of 777 years, then he died.
wow, that's amazing.
I have to think about why that is. It's a good one. Good spot there. Well, with that profound, earth-shattering thoughts, you can go have some coffee and discuss that. Why was that the case?
Roger, I had a thought. You know how it says the blood of Abel is
Yes.
soaked into the ground and crying,
Yeah.
crying out. And earlier it talks about how your toil will be hard and stuff. And we basically see how there was a good relationship between humanity and creation.
Yeah.
And then before and then after the fall, there's sort of a hardship between humanity and creation.
Yeah.
It's
let's just say a few things to finish off our look at Genesis 4, and then I've got a few sort of closing remarks. But can you see how, because of sin, we have what has been called a spiral of violence? You know, that one act of violence can lead to another act of violence, which leads to a lot of other violence, and it soon gets completely out of control. And I think probably that's what was happening in the pre-fall world, not pre-fall, the pre-flood world. What do we call that world, out of interest? Using the technical word. Who said that? Well done, Sharon. The antediluvian world is the world before the floods. Aren't you glad you came? You can impress all your friends and family by talking about the antediluvian world. And of course, after the flood is the post-diluvian world. I think that's what was happening in the antediluvian world, was that we had a spiral of violence taking place. A vengeance was let loose, really, that only a flood could quench. And it's interesting that after the flood, when Noah emerges from his ark, we're told in Genesis somewhere, I didn't write down the verse, God speaks to Noah a number of things, but one of the things he says to Noah is, he says, from each human being too, I will demand an accounting, I think it's Genesis 9, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. So it's just interesting to me that one of the first things God says to Noah when Noah emerges from the ark is to do with murder. And I just get this feeling, you know, reading the story through, that violence and vengeance had got out of control. And we're told, aren't we, in Genesis somewhere, I didn't write down the reference either, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. So we were talking about absolute depravity, weren't we? Yesterday. I'm not a particular fan of that word, or that concept, but here we see something had gone terribly wrong with the human being. Not that many generations after the creation, really, we see that every inclination of their heart was only evil all the times. The suggestion is, reading between the lines, that there was vengeance and there was murder and there was crime, and God had to bring it all to an end with a flood. So that's really, I think, the sort of thing we're getting. I think Genesis 4 probably is wanting us to, after all that happened in Genesis 1 to 3, is wanting to sort of give us a bit more information, obviously of the narrative, but also of the story of Adam and Eve and their children, but also of really a bit more about sin, what sin is like and what sin does and how sin impacts human beings. And we can sort of conclude, I think, that the first thing I would say is sin can never be isolated. It's never a sort of something that happens in isolation. It doesn't just affect the person being sinned against, but it also, particularly in the case of heinous crimes, affects the loved ones of the person being sinned against. And we see this all the time, don't we, in the news every day. Families trying to come to terms with the loss of someone and feeling like justice needs to be served against the people that have perpetrated crimes.
In that, like
Yes,
if your husband
yes.
murdered somebody, you would be affected by it, wouldn't you? So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I often feel sorry for the families of people whose family members do terrible things. The shame of that, it's hard to deal with, isn't it? Yeah, so sin is never done in isolation, particularly those type of sins. Sorry, Bean, it was all tangled around with my legs. Sorry. The second thing to say is sin can spark an unstoppable spiral of violence. It's like a fire, it catches. You did that to me. It's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, isn't it? And someone said if it was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, then the whole world would go blind. Sin really has, it's so interesting in the light of all that we've read about seeds propagating, more seeds, and, God made plants with seed in it, and, so on and so on and so on. The idea really of sin as something which can propagate itself is a really interesting thought, isn't it? That my sin damages other people, but it also propagates sin in the people that I damage. And their responses also can be sinful. And then that has a sort of snowball effect. This sort of exponential rise of the impact of one sin can go right down into a whole nation, can't it? The other thing is hinted at quite strongly is that sin is generational in Genesis 4. Cain's direct descendants were murderers also. They sound like a murderous bunch, to be honest. And although it's not sort of mentioned really in Genesis 4, the idea of accountability across the generations is also true. So there's some sort of conclusions that we can draw from Genesis 4. And perhaps it's worth saying in the light of Jesus' teaching, where he uses the same language as 77 to talk about, as I've mentioned before, about the exponential rise of forgiveness. Because I think forgiveness is like fire as well, that when we start to lose forgiveness, it has surprising effects upon people. It heals, it sets people free, and it leads to other people forgiving. We see this all the time, don't we? It's like when you have a sort of situation where one of you needs to say sorry, and, who's going to say sorry first? I know none of you have this experience, but, me and Mandy, something's happened, and one of us needs to say sorry first, and, I'm always the one who says sorry first, but to be honest, Mandy's never wrong, so no, I'm joking. But the idea is that, the minute you say sorry, they say, I'm sorry too. I'm sorry too. I'm really sorry too. Oh, and I'm sorry about that. Oh, and I'm sorry about that. It's like exponential rise of sorry and forgiveness. And it's a beautiful thing. Unless it goes wrong in the saying of the sorry, where you say, I'm sorry too, but you shouldn't have said that. It's like, you've just destroyed my sorry. Anyway, what am I talking about? That never happens, of course. No. None of you know what I'm talking about. So the last thing to say in the last 10 minutes is just the one thing I just read about from Genesis 5, actually. No, from the Genesis 9, was it? Is that there's this sort of this relationship between when Noah comes out of the ark. There's this relationship between God's prohibition against murder and the image of God. Like the act of murder, according to those verses that I just read, desecrates the image of God. That's what murder is. Something desecratory happens when somebody is murdered. That they are... Because what does it actually say, that verse? I just read it. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. So there's a relationship. And I thought it might be just nice to finish with just a thought about the image of God, because we've come across it a lot over the last 4 days. What is the image of God? And similarly, what is the likeness of God? Because in Genesis 1:26, going back to the first chapter of Genesis, it says, God said, Elohim said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so they may rule. I love this. And we find these two concepts are conveyed in the early Genesis accounts and comes out a number of times. So this idea of the image of God, I just wondered, I thought it might be just worthwhile saying a little something about it to finish on a nice positive note after all that vengeance and death. The image of God in the Hebrew is, I'm going to write it down, Betsalmenu, and that comes from the word Selem, which means image. I feel like a school teacher right now. Image of God. And it comes from the word image. The likeness of God is a completely different words. Kid mun mutenu. Kid mutenu. Likeness. I think literally this means in our image. Yeah, in our image, literally. Can't you read my writing?
Is that B-E-S or B-E-S?
It's B-E-S-T. It's sound really in Hebrew. There's not really an equivalent. Al-menu and from selem for image. And this word comes from demuth, meaning like or similar. So I'm only telling you that because it's important to realize that being made in the image of God and in the likeness of God, in the Hebrew, they are definitely two separate words, because sometimes people say that being made in the image of God, that the idea of the image of God and the likeness of God is the same thing. What we call a parallelism in Hebrew writing, we have them all over the place in Hebrew, where you have two parts of a psalm that say the same thing in different ways, but they're saying the same thing. Some people suggest that the image of God and the likeness of God are the same thing, but I would suggest they're two separate things. What do we mean then by the image of God, and how is it different from the likeness of God? In what sense are you made in the image of God and in the likeness of God? Shall I explain? I think my little analogy, it's a bit like an olive tree. Going back to my idea about the tree of life. And in the very beginning, I sort of get the feeling that God made sort of a perfect everything, yeah? There was a perfect dog. There was a perfect olive tree. There was a perfect banana. And it probably didn't look much like our bananas. But there was like an original olive tree. And from that olive tree came other olive trees because of the process of reproduction. So we have one starting olive tree, and then we have lots of multiple olive trees. Now the question is, are the offspring of the olive tree like the olive tree, the first olive tree? Yes. Are they the same as the first olive tree? Are they like the first olive tree? So the olive trees that came from the first olive tree share the likeness of the olive tree. Would you agree? But also, alongside the idea that they share the likeness of the olive tree, is it not true also that the olive tree that came from the olive tree is still absolutely and utterly an olive tree? Yeah. So it carries the nature of the olive tree. It carries the likeness of the first olive tree, but it carries the very nature of the olive tree. You could cut that thing open, you could chop it down, but it would still carry the nature of an olive tree, wouldn't it? So it has, if you like, the image of the olive tree, the image of the first olive tree is in the millionth olive tree. Even today, you look at olive tree, it carries the image of the first olive tree. What did the first olive tree look like? Very similar. Or it carries the same. It would have been in the likeness of it. But do you get the point? You get the point. Do you get the point? Anybody else? No. Thanks, Dave. Aren't you glad you came? Yes.
Are you saying that that word image really means essence?
I
Like the
think
essence of an
essence
olive-
would be good, a good way of putting it. Yeah, and the essence. Yeah.
When the plants are created, it says about after their own kind, doesn't
Yes.
it? So is that the second
So
Yeah.
the
sense?
yeah, an interesting one. So you could say that all plants share in the image of a plant, but it's more like diverse in that after their own kinds really is talking about species.
Yeah.
So the first cow was a species of cattle, if you like. That what does it say in Genesis? That they walked around on the earth or something, doesn't it? Those sort of livestock, but it's a species. So every cow, if it belongs to that kind, will share in the image of the cow. Marlene's like, what is going on? So if you look in Genesis chapter something, because I didn't write it down, Genesis chapter 5 is it? Says this, when Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image. And he named him Seth, for he was the first man. So we're told in this verse, I think it's Genesis 5, that Adam had a son in his own likeness. So Mandy had a daughter in her own likeness. So if you look at Mandy and you look at Esme, everyone look at them, you'll see that Esme looks a bit like her mum. Would you agree? Yes. Do we have any other? We do have. So over there we have Shayanu, and have a look at Shayanu, everyone, and look at Bade, and everyone can see that Shayanu belongs to Bade because she shares in the likeness of her dad and her mum. So Adam, we're told, had a son in his own likeness. He looked a bit like Adam, and his name was Seth. But he also had, it says, a son in his own image. Why does it say a son in his own image? Talking of Adam. Going back to our thing about the olive tree, if my olive tree in my garden, we have two, we now have a garden, and the olive trees share in the image of the olive tree, the first olive tree. What does that tell us about Adam? He's the original man. He's the original parents. So all of us here, we all, what did Adam look like? Well, the essence of what Adam looked like, look around. You know, we all share in that image of the first man, and here we're told that Seth shared not just in the likeness of Adam, but in the image of Adam. I think that's really interesting. I think about this in terms of the divinity, and it's my last thought, the divine nature, because we talk about Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, don't we? And of course, we know that Jesus was the exact representation of the being of God. He is the image of the invisible God. Jesus is the image of God. He carries the image of God, the essence of God, the exact substance of who God is, and yet he also carries the likeness of God. He carried the image of God, but he also was different. Similar, but different. Like Shayanu and Bade, even though they are the same family, and Shayanu came from Bade, she still looks a bit like Bade, but she is also different, unique. So I think when God made human beings in the image and the likeness of God, it was sort of like a reflection of who God is himself. That he has the the Son has the very essence of God. He's the image of God, the exact representation of God, the radiance of the glory of God, it says in Hebrews. But he was also different. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, reflected in the creation of the first human beings, a man and a woman, who shared in the image of God. Men and women together share in the image of God and share in the likeness of God. Isn't that a wonderful thought? Any questions, thoughts?
We're told to become more like Jesus, aren't we?
Yeah.
So can we become more like him, but not in his image, if you see what I mean?
That's a really good question. I suppose when we, I think it's interesting to think about what happened in the garden, because when Adam and Eve sinned, Jed and I were talking about this, when Adam and Eve sinned, they retained the image of God, didn't they, physically? They retained something of the image of God. They retained something of the likeness of God. But they also, something happened on the inside of them. They became like somebody else. They took on the image, or they took on the likeness of the serpent, didn't they? Yeah, something changed within them. They became, that's the irony of what the devil said to Eve: if you eat this fruit, you'll become more like God. But in fact, she ate the fruit and she became more like the devil. That's the great tragedy of the fall. And in fact, Jesus, when he spoke to the Pharisees, he said, "You are the children of your father, the devil." He didn't beat about the bush, because they shared in the likeness, the character, the nature of the devil through their behavior. So in that sense, we as believers, when we receive that new life within us, we're born again, we receive the image of God. We receive the likeness of God. The problem is we still have that old likeness still hanging around, still working in us. And so really to become more like Jesus is really to let the life of Jesus more loose within us. Let the image out, let the likeness out. Which is a bit reverse to the idea of me changing myself to become more like Jesus. Actually, it's about me dying to let Jesus live in me and out of me. That's the difference. Yes?
Thank you. With the fall, when they were perfect, Adam and Eve, their spirit, soul and body was all united with God.
Yeah.
But in the fall, could it have been that their soul life was affected by the enemy in their mind, will and emotions, and that's why they fell, and that's how they fell, rather than their spirit was still part
the spirit died. The spirit died.
The
spirit died. Like when we talk about death, it's not like it went, like something is alive when it's connected with God. So the fact that the human spirit was disconnected from God because of sin, that brought death into the spirit. And in fact, really the enemy moved in. Where God was, the enemy moved in. That's why they couldn't go back into the garden, because although physically they still resembled God, something had changed fundamentally within them, that now evil, sin indwelt them. And that's why they needed covering, and that's why they needed sacrifice. And throughout the whole of the Old Testament, it's a picture of covering until the day came, as I was talking to Jed, the day came when God would change what was on the inside of a human being by giving his spirit to us and giving us new life on the insides. Yeah, and so we still have this problem where we have the old spirit is still functioning. That's the bit of us that just throws up all the horrible stuff inside of us, but we have the new spirit also within us. And so our heart and mind are in between, and we have these competing, conflicting sort of things appearing in our heart, but we're called to live according to the way of the spirit. So the human heart and mind and the thoughts of the human being were deeply affected by the fall, but also they were very redeemable. They're redeemable and are being redeemed, whereas the old spirit cannot be redeemed. That has to die, and we need a new spirit, which is what happened through the cross. We get a new spirit. That's sort of a long explanation. Any final questions? Great. Well done. Thank you for being here these last 4 days. May God bless you, and may you continue to study Genesis. Amen. You're very kind.